So anyway, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or maybe even good night. Depends what time zone you're in. Thank you for attending. I'm going to be presenting on EEGs, qEEGs, brain mapping, and all that kind of stuff. I'm Dave Siever, and basically I'm an engineer at heart or by trade, and then I got involved in the working at the University of Alberta way back in the 80s, and I was designing a TMJ research lab for people with temporomandibular joint dysfunction. And while I was doing that, I discovered that stress and anxiety played a major part of dental issues, especially TMJ issues. Then I got involved in the biofeedback program under George Fitzsimmons, and then I rebuilt the lab there because it was in kind of a rough condition. And then I started building brain machines at that point and biofeedback devices. And my first biofeedback device was a Bruck stopper. It was rang an alarm when people ground their teeth in their sleep, and it woke them up till they had chronic fatigue. I don't know if it was the best device. Anyway, that's how I kind of started. Also made TENS stimulators, and then moved into CES after that, and transcranial DC stim and AC stim, and entrainment turned out to be our flagship product. 1984, an instructor in performing arts had heard about flashing lights and sounds and how they could use it to put people in hypnotic trances. So he commissioned me to build the first machine to do just that, to put his performing arts students into a trance, he used age regression hypnosis with them, and took them back to when they had their trauma, which was usually in junior or elementary school, primary school. They forgot their lines and were all traumatized. And here now, as college students, they still were dealing with that. Anyway, that was sort of the starting point at what got me going on the path I'm on now. But the EEG, I got into EEG over 20 years ago to prove that entrainment worked. And then it kept growing and growing, and then it became a clinical service that we offered at our office. Then we have a psychologist that's been working with us for a long, long time, and so the EEG thing, it became a thing. And I think you're going to see that from an engineering perspective, there's things that you're going to be happy to know about. So let's get rolling. So life begins at the edge of our comfort zone, and of course, all of us pretty much in this group are always pushing ourselves to the edge of our comfort zone, and that's why we're explorers and seekers of knowledge and things like this. Electronic engineering. This is a Delight Pro, which many of you own, and I mean, just to develop one of these devices is incredible for the detail you have to do. I mean, not only do all the push buttons have to line up with the panel, and all the LEDs line up with the spots in the panel, and there's jacks, and there's all of this, but every single part on there has electrical ratings of different kinds, whether they're inductors or capacitors or resistors or transistors, and they all have ratings in every single part. Those ratings have to be looked at and analyzed, and then you pick the correct part for the circuit, and then every single part has a length, width, and a height. Because they physically fill up the board, and so we have to draw every single part on a CAD system and then place them down so we know where they're going to be. Then every single part underneath the part has a metal pad that has to line up exactly on the circuit board so you can solder those parts down. And then, as you can see here, every single pin now has to then be traced to the parts that it's going to and connected up. And if one thing is wrong, the whole system goes down. The Delight Pro has 9,653 lines of code, and they must be perfect as well, or the software crashes. So it's quite an undertaking when you do an engineering job, and you have to be so good at it. So if an engineer hasn't been diagnosed with OCD, is he really an engineer? Maybe not. This is Niedermeyer's lament, which I think all of us in this group are probably familiar with, and this is certainly an issue that is going on these days. And I deal with clinicians all the time asking me technical questions and stuff. And this is part of the problem that I think that is occurring Now, actually, I should mention, because as I say, you saw all the what goes into building a device. So we have a large focus on what goes wrong. I mean, that's 90% of my focus is what's going to go wrong, just like astronauts do when they practice all their astronaut training is what can go wrong and how do we get around what goes wrong. So that's unfortunately, in a way, that's a lot of my focus in my career is looking for things that go wrong. And certainly in EEG, it's fraught with issues that can go wrong. So I've focused a fair bit on it. But basically, when you go to someone's workshop and they're selling machines, you want to improve your game. They want income. You don't know much about EEG and qEEG, so you're hoping for a holy grail. The manufacturers, they just happen to be selling holy grails. So you buy the holy grail only to realize later that you bought an illusion. And there's a lot more training you have to do, and maybe new equipment you have to buy, and different caps you have to get. All kinds of stuff happens and now you're in for a lifetime. So yes, so at the training, you didn't know what you didn't know. You needed to learn a lot more things about Brodmann areas and much more brain structures. You need to learn algebra, waveforms, and vector addition. Without vector addition, it's impossible to interpret montages. And I'll show you some of that. You need to understand the electronics to some degree, differential amplifiers, common mode rejection ratios, and more. You need to understand waveform processing techniques. You need to understand all the ways an EEG can go wrong. You need to be able to guesstimate what is going on in your patient's head in a dynamic way, because EEGs are fleeting and they change second by second. You must understand that there are no holy grails. Everything is hard work. So one of the things that I started doing several years ago, because there's really no database out there that has stuff categorized. So every time I have a client, we put them into a clinical category. And so all of these categories have folders in them of clients' names on them in every single one. And then we also cross-reference them to a list. And so I make up these lists. And here we have lists of two things that go on these lists. One is the clinical diagnosis. So ADD, ADHD, aggression, anxiety, other things. And then there's what we see in the actual EEG, or what was prominent or unusual in the EEG that we think stood out with that diagnosis. And so everybody gets put into two categories, the brainwave category and the clinical category on top of it all. So it gets to be quite a large cross-reference over time. And I've been doing that for quite a long time. Other things you need to know about, this is what I guess the very starting point is your cap. What kind of cap should you have? Unfortunately, a lot of people sell electrocaps. I think that is a cap you should never use for a few reasons. One is they're not flexible, and so they can, if the head is a little bit too large for the cap, you're going to be recording maybe someone with a pain response or a discomfort response. If the cap is a little loose, it's just fraught with movement artifact all over the place, and electrode pops and everything else. You really should always stick with a cap that has holes in it. That's the other problem with electrocaps too. I have seen clinicians inject a full cc under each electrode site, meaning they've got a silver dollar-sized puddle of gel underneath those electrodes. And sometimes a clinician will send me a map and there'll be two sites with exactly the same signal, the same EEG on two sites, because their puddles were so large that the two sites bridged underneath the cap. So I am dead against the electrocap. The electrocap also doesn't have any shielding on the cables, and so it's prone to a lot more noise than other caps are. The cap that I use is the MCS cap. That's my favorite cap at this point in time. I used to use the biosignal cap, which is also another fairly good cap. And there's other caps out there too, the Combi cap, which the SADARs use, and other caps. But you really want a cap that is, I think, open and has nice silver or nice sintered silver chloride rings and underneath that electrode. Here's an example of, on the right is a good electrode. On the left, that's just a terrible electrode, and there's a maker of caps that makes that. This lady had EEG that was always bouncing around. It was choppy looking delta-ish stuff that was always on her screen. And you can see that silly little button that's sticking into the electrode area The silver chloride is pretty much stripped off it. And so you're getting all kinds of galvanic action from the metals underneath it. Just a poor cap. And I don't recommend that if you see a cap like that, don't buy it. And also make sure you inspect your caps and make sure you clean them as quickly as possible after you've done an EEG as well, so that the solution doesn't eat up the silver chloride underneath. So that's some things. And other things you should look for too in buying a system is a common mode rejection ratio. And that's the ability for a differential amplifier, which EEGs have, and AMGs and EKGs, and good quality microphones that are always used in bands and stuff. And that's to cancel out noise that is common to the system. So with an EEG, I mean, you could have easily have a volt of signal coming off the lights overhead. And then you're going to amplify a volt 1,000,000 times. But if you had a common mode rejection ratio of 1,000,000, that would mean that that would be suppressed down to a microvolt, except that you're amplifying it 1,000,000 times. So it's back up to a volt again when you actually see it in your electrodes or on your screen, I mean. So that's something you need to watch out for too. The more modern systems have common mode rejection ratios of 120 dB. I wouldn't get anything under 120 nowadays for sure, and certainly MITSAR amps. I think I think most people's amps nowadays are at 120 dB, but it's very easy to count common mode rejection ratio. It's just 20 times the log of signal out over signal in, or 1 signal 2 over signal 1. If you had a common mode rejection ratio of 100 dB, just take 100 divided by 20 and you got 5, and it's 10 to the 5th, which makes it 100,000 to 1, is how much cancellation you'll get between your reference electrode and all the active electrodes on your scalp. If it's 120, well, then divide that by 20, and that's 6, so that's 10 to the 6th. So that's 1,000,000 to 1 improvement over cancellation of noise. So look for that when you buy a device. Other things, the brain is not symmetrical between the left and right hemispheres, and symmetry, you cannot achieve symmetry between the left and right sides, and the databases reflect this. They're reasonably close, but you get certainly far more signal off of a gyri than you do off a sulcus, and that just is something that we know. Other errors, bone density causes errors in the brain, and bone thickness, I mean, and density, and also conductivity of the tissue going through the layers out into the skin. Those all cause errors in the EEG that we pick up. And so that's also a part of the reason why our standard deviations in databases are typically quite wide, because there's a lot of these variances going on. This is an example. I don't like using power at all, and I refuse to use it. And this shows the distortion that power gives you as your microvolts go up. And the blue line is real microvolts, and the yellow line here is the power. And you can see here that as the microvolts start to go up and things become exponential, it gets very difficult to understand what is really going on, because things get exaggerated quickly, and you start to lose perspective on what you're actually looking at. This is something good to know. Which parts of the thalamus are involved in the different rhythms, especially the alpha rhythm of the brain. And this is why things are not phase locked when we see alpha waves in the brain or other waves. But alpha waves, of course, is the best one to notice. And it's because those different sections of the thalamus are often operating with a little bit of phase variance between them. And sometimes they're at completely different frequencies. And so it's good to understand the cortical thalamic loops and how they interact with the thalamus and when we're recording. Something else too that's important to note is that, I mean, so many of us just talk about 10 hertz, train someone for 10 hertz alpha. But the truth of the matter is this is the frequency distribution of alpha. And someone could be perfectly fine at 9. And if you train them up to 10, you could actually trigger anxiety in them. Someone could be perfectly fine at 11 or 11.5, and if you train them down to 10, they could be feeling really sluggish and have cognitive struggles. So you got to be a little bit careful, and you got to respect, I guess, a person's own signature and what's unique for them when we're doing neurofeedback or any kind of neuromodulation, because we could throw them into what we think is a good clinical place and cause pathology. This is another other research that's been going on. You can see here, eyes closed. This is a typical distribution peak of eyes closed, and the gray is eyes open down here. And again, there's distributions, and what they try to do is they try to look at these bandwidths of these amplitudes and try to determine kind of where a peak might be based on an overall volume or area underneath the curve. This is interesting here. Now, I was disappointed with the Korean database. They separated males from females, but they never looked at the menstrual cycle and between the different phases, the ovulation phase, the luteal phase, the premenstrual phase. You can see the differences in alpha magnitude as well as frequency. It's huge. And they could have, I wish they had considered this when they made their database. It would have been a much better database. But that's a lot of variance. You see, there's 2 hertz almost in variance in a woman's peak alpha frequency, and a 2-to-1 ratio easy in terms of height of that alpha based on the time in the menstrual cycle. So we have to factor that in as well. And again, when databases are made, because they don't look at these things, everybody just gets thrown into one big bucket. So standard deviations do keep kind of loose. Now, breathing is another issue too. I try to keep the atmosphere real light and fun and silly. And if I have a kid or a child coming in, usually I'll wear a funny t-shirt. If it's an older person who's more conservative, then maybe I'll wear a button-up shirt with sleeves so I look like I'm more professional, so they feel more relaxed. Because if a person starts to breathe faster because they're a little bit anxious, it starts to affect the EEG mean frequency. And we can see here, now this is hyperventilating, mind you, in this one, but we can see here in different conditions, fasting with eating and so on, and how doesn't take too long, a couple of minutes in, and you can start seeing some fairly profound differences in peak alpha frequency. So other factors. Now this one, other factors too, people often confuse theta, and there's certainly, there's theta that comes from learning, which are fleeting little tiny spindles. And then there's also theta, which is often, maybe it's like a slowed alpha rhythm, or theta that's coming from the thalamocortical network rather than just coming out of the hippocampus. I think generally this is probably not an issue because we don't have people trying to consolidate memories while we're doing EEGs. But if we are, we have to know which theta we're looking at. And I gotta say, I've seen this error happen so many times where people are trying to train theta to improve memory. And as those of you who work with ADHD, if you do that, you're just going to impair attention. And if you impair attention, memory is going to become impaired as well, if people cannot pay attention and focus on what they're learning. What I have found over the years is that if the brain runs slow, it has no brakes and you have anxiety. If the brain runs fast, you have too much gas and you have anxiety. But the treatment for either situation, even though the symptoms appear often to be very much the same between these two groups, the treatment is entirely different. These guys need to slow down. These guys, even though they have anxiety, and they come in and they say, my guy's just burning up. He's all this anxiety. We got to slow him down. I go, no, we got to speed this guy up. When we speed him up, he will actually slow down. Of course, that's what Ritalin does with ADHD children, right? Speeds them up, and then the brakes kick in on the brain, and then that calms them down. And the SMR rhythm goes up as well. But basically, the frontal lobes, which are highly inhibitory, kick in when you speed them up, and that actually calms a person down, even though anxiety is in both. Of course, all of you in this group already know that it pays to understand the Brodmann areas that are underneath electrodes. This happens to be Jonathan Walker's patient card that he gives to all his patients so they can kind of understand what they're looking at. I thought it was kind of a nice little page that he hands out. This is some stuff in more detail again. And then, and this, of course, came from Thompson's book, and showing the different ganglia circuits, cortical ganglia circuits. And I thought this was really, really well presented. And this is something that we should all know. If anything, these circuits are good things to know. Some people can get into really high detail, and of course, as we know, and which you can really get fussy with things that we might see on our EEG and really try to figure out what we're looking at. Of course, we have to know what's going on in terms of what's going on in the sulcus versus the gyrus. Like, look at this section in here. It's way in the fold. How much of that would we see on an EEG? This I don't know. Given the dynamic nature of EEG, brainwaves, it's really important to get a good intake on all aspects of their life before coming in to see you. Sleep is certainly very critical. Sleep has profound effects on brainwaves. And here we're looking at a person, and this person has been struggling with sleep issues, and he's been on clonazepam for a long, long time, I think a couple of years. And anyway, the clinician here had him quit the clonazepam for 14 days. And even though clonazepam as a benzo slows brainwaves down, we can see in the left panel here that he has a peak frequency of 7 hertz. And that is just because he is so tired out. He hasn't had a good sleep now for, well, 2 weeks pretty much. So anyway, I felt that we just couldn't use this. This is all artifact in a sense. And it doesn't really reflect his brainwaves necessarily properly when he's actually functional. So we put him back on clonazepam, let him sleep for a week, and then on the right panel you can see that indeed his 7 hertz alpha has gone down a fair chunk, and his functioning has actually improved a fair bit. So that goes to show just the power of sleep. Not that I'm certainly a supporter of taking benzos and stuff like this for sleep, because they do in the long term have a lot of problems that they generate. But it just goes to show anyway that that sleep is essential, and you must know the night before, the few nights before actually you do a recording, and how your client sleeps in general. So artifacts, let's talk about artifacts. A clinician or his or her patient walk into the treatment room. The clinician was munching on a chocolate while sipping a yummy cappuccino. Now, what could go wrong with that? Look at this. These are odors and their effects on theta. Look at chocolate especially. Spearmint too has quite an effect. So smells can have very profound effects. Of course, chocolate probably triggers a little bit of dopamine, and that probably takes the theta down. But it's really important to consider what we might be taking into our brain room or our treatment room or brain lab when we go to do an EEG on one of our patients or clients. This is the effects on alpha. And again, coffee really can suppress alpha quite a bit. And that's just the smell. They don't have to taste it. It's just the smell. So I am a real stickler. You know, don't have any smells on you at all. No, don't drink coffee prior to, like within half an hour prior to. Rinse your mouth out with water. Don't eat chocolate. Don't wear perfume. No fragrant shampoos or conditioners. And if you're an attractive young person, no revealing clothes. I mean, there's plenty of guys out there who might run all alone in a room with an attractive young lady. They might run a fantasy, and that's not going to be a good EEG. So really be sterile as possible when you go into the room to work with a client. These are recordings I've made when different things have happened. Look, I coughed, and this person's alpha went way up when I coughed. He was a little drowsier, actually making a little more theta, but it's not that it's really reflected there. But which EEG is the good one? You know, after the cough, I think he was startled a little bit despite making a little more alpha. And I need to take a few minutes to let all of that calm down. A box fell in another room, actually quite far away. It was actually outside the room entirely. And it wasn't that loud, but it was enough to trigger off a reaction in this person. So we do want to have rooms that are pretty quiet. This is a recording electropop off an electro cap, wondering what was going on. Now, we're going to get into some nitty-gritty stuff here. How deep can we go when we're trying to disseminate artifact from reality, and how does it affect our recordings? So here we see T3, T4. We've got some EMG cruising along on those two channels. Now, We've always been told that EMG shows up in the gamma bands and higher, but not if you have a single or maybe two motor units just clicking along. They're often at around 15 to 20 hertz. And they can get into your beta bands easily and be misinterpreted as an EEG. And so let's take a look at this here. So here I'm looking at a spectral output, and we're seeing that EMG is showing up at 20 hertz, and it's also showing up in gamma on T3. On T4, it's showing up at 20 hertz in that band, and less so in the gamma bands. So, I mean, these should be tailing off just like you see in all the other bands here. So that's the EMG component. So when you're doing coherence analysis, phase analysis, especially, and all your amplitudes are going to be completely wrong in those bands. And they cause all kinds of problems. Now, here's another example of there's a few things going on in this person. One is we do have some streaming EMG off T3, and it's a complex EMG as well. There's certainly a motor unit that's firing quite strongly, but there's also little wavelets mixed in from other things that have to do with EMG that are getting into that channel as well. And we also have a heartbeat that is going on in this person as well. And the heartbeat causes all kinds of issues as well. Now, one of the things about noise is always made up typically of a few frequencies. One is you're always going to have noise at the repetition rate of an event. So in this case, if this heartbeat is occurring once a second, then 1 hertz will be completely corrupted. But you will also have a spectra generated by the pulse width of that noise. And so if you had 100 millisecond pulse, that would be 10 hertz. If it was 50 milliseconds, it'll corrupt your 20 hertz band. 30 milliseconds will corrupt your 33 hertz band, and so on. So we have to understand that. And sometimes we have to zoom in on a very fast sweep and take a look at the actual width of the pulses so we know which band is going to be corrupted. I'll show you how we do that. Now, here's something else. We're looking at the data now, spectral data of that person who has that T3 EMG showing up on their T3. And of course, we're seeing one motor unit firing here, and then we see other stuff happening here. Now, this looks pretty flat, but of course, as frequencies go up, they should be getting smaller and smaller in amplitude, especially when the database here, the amplifiers were rolling off at 40 hertz. So the database expects to see a roll off. And we see it at T4, there's a nice roll off here, but it's not at T3. So when you do the statistical analysis on that, it appears to go up because the database is expecting it to go down. So relatively speaking, it's going up, even if it's basically maintaining its level. And so it really stands out well when we take a look at the stat analysis on that. Now, here's some things we can do. We can filter this. This is the raw EEG here, by the way, of T3 alone. And we can see here that we've got single motor units firing right here. Here's single ones firing, but we've got other stuff that's getting in, maybe from motor units that are farther away, and they're getting into this signal. So how is that going to affect the EEG that we perceive? Not the EEG that's real, but the one that we perceive. Well, let's filter this down. Okay, so we'll filter this down. Here the filter is set on, this is on the MITSAR, on the WinEEG. Filter is set from, under 15 hertz. And we can see that there are definite pulses coming through fairly rhythmically. And there's about 18 a second right here. Well, that's going to corrupt everything to do with coherence and phase and amplitude in that band right there. But when we take our filter, and I wish WinEEG would allow us to go to like 15 hertz, not just 5, but here it's opened high. Now we see all those other little variants that are getting into this. And now we're seeing there's like 40 of them. So that's going to affect our gamma band. So we're going to see some pretty serious stuff showing up in our 18 hertz band here and in our gamma band here, and maybe even more. So let's take a look at, here's our beta band when we're doing phase. T3, got a real problem. Okay, be absolutely aware that is not a problem with T3 from a brain perspective, that is entirely artifact showing up. And when we look at gamma, it really flags T4 because it's so different from T4 is actually the normal one. But the database is flagging as if T4 really has the problem, but T4 does not have the problem. In this case, it's actually T3 that has the problem. We'll go back to that and take a look. We can see here in the spectral that T4 does not have the problem. But relative to T3, it appears to have, it's hypoactivate, it's got a hypophase problem. It's got a real phase disharmony. So doesn't mean that T4 has got the problem. And sometimes that's the problem with these databases you have to understand. That's why you have to do all these other metrics so you understand that just because I see it at T4 doesn't necessarily mean that T4 has the problem. It could just have a problem relative to T3. And in this case, that's what the issue is. T3 has the problem with noise. Other things you have to look at. Is the EMG coming from T3 or is it actually coming from maybe a corrupted reference? Well, when you're doing a referential recording, there's two rules and they're beautiful. And that's one of the things I like about referential recordings is they don't confuse the issue like other montages can. Well, two rules. One is if the artifact was in the reference, we would see phase locked EMG or EEG, fake EEG across all the channels, and they would get larger as you got towards the midline, because as you get further away from the reference, you become more dissimilar. So if you're doing linked ears, the midline is most dissimilar from the references on the earlobes. And so you're going to see maximum EEG, or in this case, EMG masquerading as EEG at the midline. But it'll be phase locked as you go from, let's say, from CZ down to C3 down to down to T3, and the other way, you know, C4, T4, and same thing with the parietal, temporal areas and frontal areas. You would see that they're quite phase locked, almost perfectly phase locked, because whatever gets in the reference gets distributed in a phase locked way to all the other channels in the cap. So anyway, phase locked, and you typically will see that the amplitudes are increasing towards the midline. So important to know that. But if you want to, you can also take this and you can drop this into bipolar montages and take a really good look at it from a bipolar perspective. When we look at T3 versus F7 or T3 versus T5, of course, we do see the EMG showing up. And we should, because they're dissimilar. But we don't see it growing as you get towards the midline. Everything is just now normal EEG distribution towards the midline. So this means that indeed that EMG we saw, that's another way of showing or another way of proof checking that it was not in the references. It just happens to be getting into T3 as an EMG artifact. Or you'd see it phase locked as you went towards the midline, as you went T3 to, in this case, let's say T3 to FP1 to F7. Yeah, this is longitudinal, T3, T5, and so on. So we're seeing it longitudinally, which we should see, but also we're going to see it transverse. And that's what I wanted to show you. So C3 to T3 to C3, you see it showing up here, but you don't see it showing up from C3 to CZ, for instance, or CZ, wherever that one is. Here's C4 to CZ and doesn't show up there. C3 to CZ. C3 to CZ. Here it is, right here. So it doesn't show up there. If it did, say again, if it was in the reference, you would see this EMG show up across all the channels as it made its way towards the midline. And it shows it just in the adjacent channels, longitudinally and transversely. So we know it's isolated strictly to T3, and it's not reference. Now, when you get into looking at this in greater depth, here's the heartbeat. Clipping along right here, right here, right here. How's that heartbeat going to affect things that we look at? Now you can see some of this heartbeat is out of phase when it got into different channels, and some of it's in phase. So some channels are in phase and some channels are out of phase. So there's two groups here. Group 1, T4 and F8 are in phase. T4 and F8 up here. Those two are in phase. They both go down together. But the other ones, group 2, are are in reverse phase. They're 180 degrees out of phase. So T3, T5, P3, CZ, and PZ, group 2, are all in phase, but they're out of phase with group 1. So when we do coherence measures, phase measures, well, we're going to see some real anomalies here. You get a few hundred heartbeats adding up, and it starts to get into the Q. So here I'm looking at 120 millimeters per second, and you have to often speed your EEG up to look at anomalies. And what we're looking at here, some of these pulses are pretty short. This is 25 to 30 milliseconds, these little pulses, but some are also longer. Look at these pulses here are longer. So some channels are longer and some channels that pulse is pretty tight. The width of these pulses is going to definitely affect the band that you're going to see phase issues and coherence issues show up on. This is a wider one here. These are shorter ones here. So you sometimes have to really eyeball a recording in high detail to see what's going on. So let's take a look at that. Well, remember the group 2 that are all kind of in phase and how they're out of phase with other things? This is all noise. I would not rely on that for anything. And that's in the gamma 1 band. Well, that's some of these channels were in the gamma 1 band, getting around 33 hertz and so, and some were higher, and some were in the gamma 2 band. And here's the gamma 2 phase, which was showing up mostly on these 2 channels here. That's entirely noise. It's got nothing to do with a person's EEG whatsoever. And all the things you see on a Q, if you zoom in into high speed, whether it's 60 or 120, often 120, you will see those waves reflect what your Q is showing you. You absolutely will. It's not magic. It's beautiful that it can crunch hundreds of these things per second that we can't, or in a few seconds that we can't possibly do mathematically. But you can go in there and you can scroll through this at high speed, like really spread out, and you will see what the Q is telling you. And I highly recommend you do that just to confirm artifact versus real EEG. Here's some other things. So this is interesting here. Of course, sometimes you get people with lots of eye movement and lots of EMG in their eyes. And what do you do about it, right? It just messes up the whole recording. I like to always get as clean a data as I can possibly get. I don't want to clean up that data with ICA later. It just corrupts everything else and makes a bigger mess. Want to get it clean in the first place. Now take a look at this lady. This is her. Look at all that eye movement. Now watch what's going on here. I'm just going to watch this video. See those eyes rolling? Well, you got a client that's doing that. I have Velcro pieces that I've put into sunglasses and I fold these cotton wads over. And just a mild pressure on the eyeballs makes a huge difference in what they do. Now look how much cleaner this is. She still has a huge amount of EMG. Now, when someone has a huge amount of EMG, and it's in wintertime especially, one of the first things I ask them is, do you take vitamin D? Because muscle tension is associated with vitamin D deficiency. It's been well established. This lady, she's like, I've never taken vitamin D in my life. Oh, so I gave her 5,000 IU of an oil. Don't use the pills. Get an oil, put it on the tongue, 5,000 IU. I waited 20 minutes. Look how much it cleaned her up. Look at the difference. This pre-vitamin D, post-vitamin D. I'm a vitamin D guy, as those of you who heard my lectures. It's important stuff. Cleaned her up a lot. Well, now I've got an EEG I'm willing to work with. And she definitely, we know she needs to take vitamin D. You can also see, I think probably her alpha has increased as well, being on vitamin D. That's pretty common. This is something you guys already all know. This is a lambda artifact, eyes open, just from staring at the little square I have on the wall. And sometimes they drift off a bit. Then when their awareness snaps sort of back in, they will pop off this little artifact. Referential artifact or real, because this is hypercoherent alpha. Well, one of the rules is, does it get larger towards the midline? Well, no, it doesn't. This is really larger in the occipital parietal, some in the temporal. But the next test you would do, is it in phase? We're not entirely in phase here. When we zoom in to high speed recording, we're fairly phase locked, but we're certainly not high speed. So those two rules are broken. So this is not a reference artifact. But here's some of the things that I don't like about different montages. Referential, I can wrap my head around. You can do vector addition with referential quite well. But look at these channels up at the top, which are just choppy little bits of beta stuff, and there's no alpha in the frontal channels at all. Here's a Laplacian recording, and look how that changes that. And look at Laplacian. Sometimes Laplacian, if I have a couple issues with Laplacian, is all your electrodes that are around the perimeter of your cap are referenced against 3 other electrodes. The ones in the middle are referenced against, I think, 7 electrodes, and so you have difference in the weighting that you're going to see. But when you get into a whole head average, especially, now when we look at the size of these, alpha, this alpha stream here, then they get a little smaller in temporal parietal. So we've got 2 channels that are quite large. We have another 4 channels that are getting smaller. There might be a little bit in the central area, not too much. Well, when you average this alpha, let's assume, I'm going to just make up a number. Let's say this was 10 microvolts or 15 microvolts back here, 10 microvolts here, maybe 5 microvolts here. So when you take the vector addition of all 19 channels, and the fact that these are almost phase locked, but not quite, but they're hypercoherent. So you can almost add them up together. As we saw back here, when we zoomed in tightly, you see that they're fairly tight on the phase lock, but they're not entirely phase locked, but they're pretty close. So they're going to add up quite a bit. But you take that, let's say we had 15 here, we had 10 here, we had 5 or 6 here, and you average that across 19 channels. Well, now you're going to get a net result of maybe 5 microvolts here and 3 microvolts here, and so on. But what's going to happen is that the channels that are in the front that had no alpha on them at all are now going to be, of course, we'll call these flatlined in alpha, but now they're going to be compared against the new norm, which is 5 microvolts of alpha. And so the computer is going to generate fake alpha in these channels, and they're going to be phase inverted as well, because they're basically flat. So if these are going up and down, if you're going positive 5 microvolts here, and this is a flat line, it's going to come out as minus 5 microvolts, similar to what you get in a bipolar recording. So you get phase inversion on all these other channels that have nothing to do with this, and it's because it's doing a vector addition on all 19 channels, and this whole head average is absolutely incorrect, and it cannot be used whenever you have a bunch of hypercoherent channels. In any frequency band, you will get phase inversion in the bands that don't have it, and it's all an illusion. So be very wary of that. For vertex, of course, it just subtracts it from CZ. So I don't know what use vertex is always is, generally speaking. And Laplacian, if your adjacent channels surrounding the channel of interest are also quite hypercoherent, you can see phase inversion in that channel, in the channel of interest as well. And that is also an error. And this is why I strongly defend referential, because you can see it and you can wrap your head around it with those 2 rules. Does it get larger towards the vertex? And are they phase locked? Which you can tell by zooming in at high speed. These other ones are getting much, much harder to wrap your head around, to know what you're actually looking at if there's an artifact. And Laplacian and whole head average base their results on referential in the first place. So if you've got all kinds of corruption in referential, that corruption carries over into these other montages and gets amplified, and it makes a new norm. And then you think maybe you've got a clean display, and you actually do not. Then it's just more difficult to figure out. So anyway, I do defend referential myself, and for those reasons of vector addition and how the computer can recalculate things and make stuff so complicated now that you cannot wrap your head around it and understand what you're actually looking at. And so many clinicians can't, especially the new ones, right? And when you've had the kind of experience that Mary and John and John LeMay, John Anderson and other people have had, you can probably wrap your head around this to some degree. But a lot of the new starters they'll just assume it's fine, and that they have inversion going on with phase that is in actuality not real. So be very careful with using average, even Laplacian. These are meant to be used for outliers, not for general averages like you see down here where we have several hypercoherent channels. This is interesting here. Man, I took a lot of recordings before I had something like this happen. This lady has a sleep disorder, and she went literally from beta, and she fell asleep in like 4 seconds. And then her hand fell off the chair, and it kind of woke her up, and then she was back into beta again. So she had a little cat nap of 4 seconds or 3 seconds. And it just shows how all the different frequencies compare against each other as she drifted into the different states, from basically sort of a beta state, I guess, to a theta to alpha, alpha to delta to theta. That was pretty cool. Of course, everybody knows what mu rhythms are, typically on C3, C4. This isn't the best example, but it's there. We can see it showing up. And this is an Asperger's child. Now we're going to get into some stuff to do with discharges and dipole versus, radial versus tangential. Radial comes off a gyrus, sorry. And it's radial because it comes from the radius. It's a radius coming outward. And of course, the dipole, we're going to see one thing here, but on the soma of the cell and down through the axons, there's going to be the other polarity is going to be showing up there. So you're only going to see one polarity on the surface electrode. When you have a tangential dipole, you're going to see a voltage on one side and a voltage on the other side. And it's easy to see how this shows up. And we can see here the radial dipole here. So all the signals are in fairly phase harmony, or they're hypercoherent. When it's tangential, you get phase inversion. And you can see this really easily on qEEG. Something to do with seizure that you might find interesting, and this is one of my issues that I take with neurofeedback, is everybody in neurofeedback, they might see someone with seizure issues, they say, let's just do SMR up training and blah, 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 and theta down training. And sometimes it gets, again, you use the treatment that you know, but if your only tool is a hammer, then the whole world's a nail, kind of an effect. And look at this study on vitamin D. The first thing if someone has seizures is you ask them, are they taking a good vitamin D, and it needs to be an oil? If no, get them on vitamin D. This study showed remarkable reductions, and some people had 100% remission of their seizures when they got onto a vitamin D program. Very, very important. Just don't overdose them on vitamin D. So here's someone with a radial seizure, and so you can see the parts I've highlighted here. There's the left side where everything was going electronegative or positive, depends how you look at it. And here's the right-hand side, which in the list, the left marker here, this is the right marker here. And we don't see the other dipole. It's down into the brain. So we see just a general whole huge area that's all got the same polarity at this point. And then we see this other point here, and it's all got now the other polarity as that discharge is going through the process. And so that would typically be a radial seizure. So let's take a look at a tangential seizure. Now, tangential seizure, a couple of things you're going to notice right off the bat. Compared to the radial, we see that all these waves are going in the same direction, downward or upward. Tangential, you get phase inversion. So some are going down and some are going up. See, these are going up, these are going down. And that's where the dipole is. So we know that this discharge is sideways to the skull. So we see negative here, positive here on the marker on the left side. And then on the right-hand side, we see the inversion starting to happen. Wasn't as strong an effect on that section, but it was still there. So that is one way of using, simply just using qEEG to determine the type of seizure a person is having. And you can also then run it into bipolar, which of course neurologists always do. And you can take a look now at the adjacent sites, and you can tell if the seizure is running longitudinally or transverse. Here we see phase inversions occurring a little bit, F4 to C4. So this is longitudinally. We see some phase inversion going on. Not a lot, but a little bit. But when we go transverse, I think the phase inversion got significantly higher. So we can find out where the locus of that is. Of course, you can kind of see it. I mean, it already shows it really in the picture here. But if you want to get the references out of your picture and really look at the discharges, because references can throw things off, then you must go to a bipolar montage and get rid of the references and see what's really going on between those electrodes. And here we see where the locus of that seizure is really occurring. And it's in this section, more transverse than it is longitudinal. Hello, brain buddies. I accidentally made a mistake when I was copying my seizure slides over to my paroxysm slides. So I'll be talking about paroxysms in the next little bit here, not seizures. It was just an error on my part. Sorry about that. I have a lot of clients with a great deal of childhood trauma, and they have cortisol damage to the entire limbic system. And it causes thalamocortical instabilities, typically when they sleep. And they're seeing a talk therapist, and they wake up 100 times a night. And the talk therapist says, well, that's all your trauma getting into your dreams and stuff, and it's waking you up because you're having panic attacks, and they're tired and they can't function well, which keeps their cortisol up, which causes continued damage to the cortex and the thalamus. But when you map them and eyes closed, in this case, yeah, they look pretty good. So why are you having all these issues? Well, they've got these sleep issues, and you could send them off to a sleep lab, and that might take several months. And often people don't sleep well in a sleep lab because it's a foreign environment. They got a cap on their head. People are staring at them. People often don't sleep well, so they may not see anything in a sleep well. But there is one thing that induces sleep like there's no tomorrow, and that's entrainment. It knocks people out almost guaranteed. So we put them on entrainment. 15 minutes later, they're sound asleep. And look at what we're seeing. So all people who have these types of symptoms, I always put them on entrainment, put them to sleep, and I watch them seize. And not only do you see the seizure going on, but you also see the SMR bursts happening too, which is often common with seizure type activity. We can see here that there's definitely phase inversion. So it's a tangential issue going on. We see that right here. So I use entrainment all the time as a mini sleep lab, and it works very well. In fact, once they're asleep, you can turn the entrainment off, and they will continue to show epileptiform activity. So you can prove that the entrainment is they're not having a photic-induced seizure. They will continue to show this activity, which is typical in their sleep patterns anyway, until they wake up. And then it'll clear up, and they'll just give you little alpha spindles again, as if nothing ever happened. So I see this mostly in clients who have got a great deal of childhood trauma, and I attribute it to cortisol damage to the thalamocortical regions and the limbic system. Now, what's interesting about this person here is when we do phase measures, just the darndest thing, see, I analyze so much stuff. Look at how phase in the beta band and in the theta band matches those discharge profile that we see here in the polarity that I looked at. Isn't that interesting? And this is the qEEG. This is not looking at the small little wavelet like we saw here, where we see that profile showing up as your discharge patterns. This is the Q over minutes, also reflected that same pattern. So for me, this is like more things to research, right? Isn't that fascinating that it does it? And it did it in these two bands. Why? I could see maybe the theta band showing it, but why in the beta band? More stuff to research. And here's another example. This guy here, his hand would twitch too. Sometimes my clients will do that. Normally, when I do a recording, I am 2 feet from their face, and I'm between my screen and their face, because sometimes I want to get right into their face, because I want to make sure I don't see their face twitching or their eyes twitching, because then it would be an artifact. And sometimes it's difficult to separate a discharge from an artifact. And so I have to get pretty close, and I have to watch them within 6 inches. Hold your breath when you do that, Because if you breathe on your client and they feel that breath, you might startle them. They might go, whoa, and they'll jump and they'll see your face in their face and they'll jump. So I've learned to hold my breath when I get really close to my client and look very, very carefully when I'm seeing these discharges to make sure it's not an eye roll or something like that. This person also would have a little twitch of their hand. And some people have twitches of their feet as it gets into the motor strip a little bit every time they show a discharge. And we can see that this here is what kind of discharge? Radial. This lady was interesting, and it took us a long time to get this. And she has issues with fluorescent lights when she goes to work. And sometimes her head gets all muddled and she can't think and concentrate and stuff. And sometimes she doesn't. So we turned our lights on, we turned them off, we turned them on, we turned them off. And we did this many times over the course of a couple hours, like on for 5 minutes, off for 5 minutes, on for 5 minutes, off for 5 minutes. Sometimes she had no response at all. In fact, 2 times out of 3, she had no response at all. And every third, she'd suddenly pop off this activity when the light went on. So it confirmed what she was saying. But I'm trying to do DC recordings. I'm really trying to do DC research, and DC is so difficult to do. It is extremely difficult to do. You need to have impedances below like 500 ohms. Typically, you need to draw blood, so you break the capacitance of the electrode to the skin, or you have capacitive effects. And this is why I'm often dubious of some of this infraslow stuff that I see, because they just have standard 5K connections and they don't break the skin when they do that type of neurofeedback. So I'm often a little wondering if it's how legitimate it is. I guess if there's clinical effects, then that's maybe good enough. But so this here is the DC effects, and we're looking at millivolts. I mean, this is all in the black, so it's probably, at least I did that to accentuate the effect, but we're probably looking at plus minus 2 millivolts, not microvolts, millivolts. And look at how it corresponds with that abnormal activity. So her brain is going wildly in huge directions from a DC perspective, while it is modulating down her alpha rhythm. And this is where I think a thalamocortical disconnect comes in that I've been researching with my concussion people, that it gets so hyper. Some of those people, I've seen them at -4 and -5 millivolts, not microvolts, millivolts, and they have no alpha waves. And I think that sometimes maybe what I'm seeing is an effect that is gating off the thalamus, and they can no longer make alpha waves or delta waves and so on. So anyway, it's pretty difficult to get a DC map because it's so difficult getting DC recordings. They're very challenging, but I thought it was just really cool from a research perspective that we have a fairly close match from severe DC voltages on the skin compared to where we're seeing the dysfunction in her brain. So just cool things. And here's another DC offset slide here going again, showing this is another person here. And I'm looking at them on a millivolt level. So that's why you can't see their wavelets, because I've zoomed out hugely. I'm on 2 millivolts per division here. So you don't see their activity. I mean, it's there, but it's very, very tiny. And we can see what's going on from different things. And this is about where I'm going to stop. Well, no, I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm not going to get into all the rest of this. But one of the types of anxiety that I always struggle with, again, brainwaves are very dynamic, and people can have anxiety that's fleeting on the moment. And because I deal with people who can't make alpha because of thalamocortical disconnect that's post-concussion and sometimes post-viral, I have to make sure that I'm not looking at psychological anxiety and I'm looking at neurological anxiety. Neurological anxiety, people cannot make alpha. Psychological anxiety can. And I need to always tease out those two types. And there's other types of anxiety, but I'm not going to look at those ones right now. So this is a real important thing to look at when you're doing a recording. If someone, in this case, this person cannot make alpha. So I just whisper quietly. This is an anxious businessman who's got 5 businesses running. He works 16 hours a day, and 2 of them are going into bankruptcy and whatever else. And his brain is racing endlessly. And I say quietly to them, let your thoughts go. And boom. Alpha. He'll give me a big chunk of alpha for a minute till they start thinking again, and then the alpha will slowly go down and disappear. But I know now that this is artifact. This is reflecting a psychological condition, not a neurological condition. And he needs counseling and stress management, maybe sell off some of his businesses. I'm not going to rely on this in my queue at all. This I will rely on. This is his real activity when he's not all wrapped up in all his stresses. So, and normally he's fine. So anyway, he's just thinking way too much. I've seen this in grad students. Believe me, I've done this on grad students, and they are alpha suppressed most of the time until you say, let your thoughts go. In fact, this is a stressed college student from Saybrook working on her PhD, and she could not make alpha. Let your thoughts go. Second later, bang, just pounding out the alpha. Here's another person who, believe it or not, and some people, these are the types of people when you do biofeedback and they get worse because they cannot relax. And this person is making some alpha, but not very much, little bits here and there. And I said, let your thoughts go. Now they're trying to relax and they actually suppress all their alpha. Well, then you know from a biofeedback and from a counseling perspective what to do with these people between heart rate variability and other forms of biofeedback. This is really a psychological condition, not a neurological condition. This person does not know how to relax. And every time they have a little challenge, they tense up. Another person here, let your thoughts go. Again, can't make alpha. A 40-year-old male, let your thoughts go. Boom, all this alpha. This is the activity that I'm going to process if they want to be processed, but really the issue is psychological. It's not really so much neurological. And they need counseling and they need stress management and they need biofeedback and things like this, not neurofeedback. So I'll show you this 40-year-old male right here. When you process this side versus processing this side. And what we see, of course, on the that side, this is their activity here. And once I said, let your thoughts go, and they bursted me with alpha. Now this is data. Oh, no, this is story. This is stat. Funny that I didn't look at it from the data perspective because the other one's on data. When I said, let your thoughts go, then all their alpha bursted, and this is what they gave me for alpha. I should have made those two match. I don't know why I have one on this one on data and the other one on stat. Sorry about that. But anyway, we definitely know that on this image here, they're basically alpha suppressed left of the line, and now they're giving me alpha to the right of the line. And so you can process it if you want to show the differences between those two states of mind, but they are psychological conditions, not neurological conditions. And that's where I'm going to stop. I got another 50 slides after this, but I think that's enough for today. So I'm going to stop here. I want to thank you all for attending.